Okay. Alright. You're probably wondering, what are these massively heavy things I'm holding here? Coils of wire. Got loads of them. Some of the leftovers from my early attempts to make free energy with Joseph Newman's ideas. Well, it cost me hundreds of dollars and hundreds of hours of time, and did I ever make free energy? No, not quite. It was fun experimenting, but it appears that a lot of what Joe says is not true. I guess there's some that would argue I didn't make my motor right, but I've tried several variations of his ideas. I will admit they weren't quite as big as his. The biggest one I built was about 50 pounds, 50-pound coil, and about 10 or 15 pounds of magnets in it. I constructed special commutators. I did the whole thing. And from everything I can see of Joe's latest test results, he's hiding important data when he does his test. And just to give you some food for thought, if I wanted to prove to you that I had a free energy motor, let's just say I claimed that this DC motor I'm holding in my hand put out twice as much energy as it used. Wouldn't it be simple to verify if I was making free energy? I could simply take another motor that also works as a generator, hook it up to the shaft, it could spin around, I could take the output from the second generator, feed it back into the first generator, and it should keep running. Perpetual motion, right? How come Joe never does that if he's produced a free energy motor? I don't think he has. I do believe he's found some interesting results of a result of his experiment, and I'm all for experimenting. Even if the physics books say it's not possible, I still like to experiment. I got a good hands-on experience with some of the do's and don'ts of electromagnetism. Now, one of the myths, I should say, that I want to dispel is some of Joe's public demonstrations where he shows his motors turning a huge flywheel and pumping some water, and he raves about, you know, how highly efficient his motors are. And I don't know exactly how efficient his motors are, but I will say this: I'm not impressed with what I've seen. I looked up some data on DC water pumps to see what they're capable of in terms of gallons per day based on input power. And from what I've seen, they're able to do everything Joe's motor can do. Now, one of the things that you may have been real impressed with is looking at how he's able to turn that huge motor with that huge flywheel with just a small input current. Well, guess what? I can do the same thing with a big DC motor. In fact, if you take note of what I'm doing here, I've got a AA battery in my hand. I'm going to hook it to this wire, and the shaft will turn. Well, it did turn anyway. Let me see if I can get this on here right. It's hard to hold everything on here. Oh, this is bad. There we go. Now you can see it turning. Got a magnet positioned on the top here so you can see it turning as I've got to hook this AA. Now, I had a platform on this motor, and I used to let kids sit on it, and it was fun to give them rides. They'd spin around in circles, and you could just take a couple of these little batteries here and hook them up, and that's all the power it took to spin the kids around. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because Joe does similar demonstrations where he shows how he's able to turn this huge flywheel with a lot of weight on it, and you're supposed to be impressed because he's turning a flywheel. Well, a flywheel on a good bearing doesn't take much power. This motor, without a load on it, only draws 0.15 watts. And that's another thing I want to talk about are amps and volts and watts, because a lot of what Joe says in his videos is misleading to people that don't understand what a watt is and what a volt is, and what an ampere is, for that matter. When I made my first big Newman motor, I was all fired up and excited, and I went out and I wound a coil that had 30 pounds of number 30 gauge wire in it. The thing was so laborious, it took from morning till night on a revolving spindle to just unravel the wire that was on my spools and to get it onto this great big spool that I made. Now, when I was done with this thing, I was so excited. I remember hooking it up to a battery, and I was able to get an awful lot of torque out of this thing. Very little input power. In fact, I used to call my friends over and tell them to try to hold the shaft on this thing with their hand to see how much torque it had. Nobody could stop it. And I thought I was onto something really big, because this thing used such a small amount of current to power itself. I think it was probably 1/100th of an amp or something like that. I remember I called with this one friend of mine that was an electrician, and I said, "Hey Bernie," I said, "check this out. Look at this motor I made." I said, "It uses 1/100th of an amp," or something along that line. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact amperage. It was very low. So my friend looked at it for a minute, and he says, "Wow, interesting. Well, what voltage are you applying?" And I said, "Well, what's that matter?" And he says, "It matters a whole lot. Watts equal volts times amps. You can't just look at the amperage." And I didn't quite get it at first, and then it dawned on me, oh, you mean to come up with the amount of power this thing is using, I got to know the volts and the amps. Okay, a lot of you are thinking, duh, who doesn't know that? Well, I didn't know it. I was kind of new to electronics. So I got caught up with the idea that when I'd hook up my amp meter here and it barely moved the needle, that I was doing something extraordinary. And obvious as this may be to you seasoned electronics experts, there's a lot of people being taken by Joe's ideas because they don't know the difference between a watt, a volt, and an amp. Joe did do some things in the early days of his experiments that intrigued a lot of people, are still sort of thought-provoking. I don't fully understand it. I don't know how he got all his engineers to back him. All I know is if you look at his present-day data on his motors, there's something very wrong with the kind of results he's displaying to the public. There are ways to verify what he's doing without all the nonsense, and yet he takes a complicated road. Now, the one thing I've been curious about, if you looked at one of his early videos that was, I believe it was shown on the Johnny Carson show when he was getting a lot of media attention, it showed him charging up some dead AA batteries while this motor ran. Well, even though the batteries did have more power in them when the motor was done running, what may have caused that is not necessarily a recharging effect, as he claimed, but the fact that the batteries were warmed up because of the back spike that came out of the motor. You know, to explain this better, if you took this single AA battery, let's say it was 95% dead, you put it in the oven, and you warmed it up for a while, not so hot to where the battery will explode, but as hot as this battery can handle it. You left it in there for an hour, you pull this battery back out of the oven, it's going to have a lot more power in it. Now, obviously you didn't put energy back into the battery from the oven, but what you did is you caused a chemical reaction in the battery to cause it to continue to put a little bit more out. And I have a hunch that that's what Joe did in that early video without realizing it. That motor he had to be producing a tremendous back spike. So even if he just had a few fractions of an ampere going into it, the back spike has tremendous power coming out, although it's for a shorter time duration, so it's not, overall it's not more power output. That might have been enough to warm the battery up to perhaps cause it to generate a little more energy. I'm sorry if I'm confusing some of you. I'm trying to explain this all quickly here. But anyway, yeah, hey, I'm all for experimenting, you know, and I admire Joe for challenging the laws of physics. I just don't think he should fabricate his test results in a way that makes it appear that he's putting out more energy than he actually is. He's even got people backing him that have degrees, and I think they're being taken. I mean, do your homework on the man and see if you're really convinced that this machine puts out everything he claims it does. Alright, thanks a lot for listening. See, time's running out here.